I talk about the invisible architecture. I suppose I'll put a bit of context on like who I am and my general background. So I was trained as an architect in Dublin, in University College, Dublin. So that would have been back in the 70s, and I qualified in 1976, and I seem to have been poor since then. As a student, I always seemed to have money in my pocket, and as soon as I started working, I suppose life just changed completely, and I came under, pressure to settle down. And I suppose one of the aspects of settling down was buying a house, and I looked at sort of various houses that were for sale in Dublin, and they were all second-hand houses, all used houses that need to get fixed up and so on. They were just starting to open up the inner city, and it was the trendy thing to do, to buy a little artisan dwelling and fix it up and da-da-da. And none of it really appealed to me. And I remember one Saturday morning looking at a house in the inner city in Dublin, and I knocked on the door, and someone answered the door, and I saw down the hallway this woman came out of a bedroom in a sort of ratsy bathrobe and a cigarette hanging out of her mouth, and shuffled off to the bathroom. And I thought, I don't want to look at this house, and I certainly don't want to buy this house. I don't want to have anything to do with it. And it was just a purely instinctive sort of response to just the whole property thing and the whole idea of buying a second-hand place and all the vibrations that you're buying along with it. And it just seemed like an awful lot of work that I'd have to basically fix the whole place up. And it just didn't appeal to me, and I thought, no, that's sort of it. And I was also having struggles, I suppose, as an architect working in an office in Dublin, which sort of lasted for about 3 years, and I moved around for different jobs, convincing myself I was just getting experience, but really I was just totally unsettled with the whole architectural profession, and it was completely different being a student, and it's like all this pressure about, settling down and conforming and getting bank loans and mortgages. Just none of it really appealed to me. And I really didn't feel I was an architect. I was given a commission in the office I was working to design a Catholic church. They were building lots of Catholic churches in the suburbs of Dublin in the 70s because the population was growing, and every architectural practice in Dublin had like 2 or 3 churches going, and okay, here you go, Peter, here's church design. Now, I'd been born into the Catholic faith, but I'd only ever briefly been a believer in it. And I made one really, really good confession in my life, and it was such a disappointing experience that I thought, oh, that isn't the religion for me. But the curious thing about it was I couldn't come up with a design for the church. So the boss would come in the morning and go, oh, how's everything going? And come over and look at the desk and said, what about the design? And, oh, I haven't come up with anything yet. I literally couldn't create a design for this church. Now, I had been a reasonable student. I'm not a fabulous architect, I'll tell you that at this point. But I was always a reasonable student, and I had a flair for design. So I couldn't figure out, why could I not design this church? So I took it all as a judgment on myself. I'd started doing creative writing as a sort of evening activity, and I really loved that. I felt that was really my true calling. And with the pressure about the mortgage and settling down and all that stuff, I thought, I can't hack this. So I basically gave my notice in to the office. I bought a ticket to go to Europe. I sold my car, gave up my flat, and went off and wrote a novel. And during that period, I just changed my life completely. I met this really interesting woman from California who was a painter, took up with her, and I just literally turned my back on all the, I suppose, the certainties as they were presented to me in Ireland in the 70s. The church, the state, and basically the financial system. And I faced into all the uncertainties that dropping out, delivers. And none of them really manifested themselves. I never went hungry. I never was stuck for a place to stay. And I had complete freedom of movement. I wasn't burdened by property or anything like that. So I just led this really, really creative life, which included, being a hands-on parent. And there were lots of bouts of poverty in it. But it just opened up this whole world to me. And of course I had to earn a living. And some of that living was earned by doing small building projects. My dad had been not an architect, my dad had been a carpenter, so I had a little bit of sort of background in the whole building thing. And that was an interesting experience, actually working as a small builder. And I remember most of this was happening in Europe, going to the builders providers in Spain and saying, I want a bag of cement, I want 25 concrete blocks, and they sold sand in bags as well, and my Spanish isn't very good. And the guy said, well, how are you taking it? And I said, well, I'm taking it in the car, and I had a trailer. And he sort of went, okay. Loaded it all up, paid the bill, got in the car, put it in gear, and I thought, what's the problem? Let out the clutch. The car wouldn't move because I had put so much weight into the trailer, into the back of the car. So I had to sort of take half of it out and leave it at the side of the road. But it was a real illustration of the link between what was on the drawings and reality. So it was a real sort of wake-up call, particularly in terms of, my understanding of myself as an architect. I got trained as a salesman. I got all sorts of different jobs I did during my life, and I was very much involved in my wife's work as a painter. When our daughter was time for her to go to school, we went back to Ireland. She was about 4, and we went to a rural large community. I'd been sort of born in the city and grew up in the city. We went to a rural community where they were starting a Steiner school, and loads of people were saying to me in that community, oh, could you give us some advice? And I'd go out and look at a house that they'd bought, and they were trying to fix it up, and they'd gotten really stuck. And this happened sort of repeatedly, so I thought, no, maybe it's time for me to open a little architectural practice. So I said this to Sharon. I said, maybe I should open a little architectural practice. She said, Peter, don't waste your time. She said, all these guys think they know everything. Like, how can that be? They obviously don't know everything because they're asking me all these questions. But there was a grain of truth in what she said. Her experience in California had been a lot of alternative communities where the guys just started building houses, and the women and children sort of had to put up with the results, that the guys didn't really know what they were doing, but everybody sort of had to bow down to it. And that sort of inspired this idea of be your own architect. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll teach people how to be their own architects, because they obviously needed the information in order to avoid the problems they had created. So basically, the sorts of problems they were creating, they were able to advance so far until they were really stuck, and then they were sort of asking me as the last resort. So I made up a little poster, be your own architect, not that particular one. And of course, none of the guys came. 2 or 3 women came, and that was actually good, because I was very embarrassed. We sort of sat down in the back kitchen, and I didn't know what to say. I hadn't prepared anything. I had assumed I could just blah, 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 talk my way through it. And it was like a real shock for me, like, I don't know actually what to tell them. I don't know how to tell these people how to design a house. When I come to think of it, I don't actually know how to design a house myself. So it was like, how can this be? I spent 5 years in architecture school. I have a degree and everything else. I only worked for a few years at the job, but like, the house is like the basic architecture. How come I don't know how to do it? So I had to start looking into that. And I realized pretty quickly, oh, the house really was never part of the tradition into which I had been initiated, the formal, what I'll call the formal architectural tradition. It had always been something completely separate from that tradition, and I hadn't been trained in that tradition of house building. So I started putting the information together on house design, because traditionally that information was handed down orally, was never actually written down. So when people stopped, building their own houses, when people stopped imparting that information to their children or to their tribes people and so on and so forth, really the hard information had died away, but it still remained in, let's say, in our genes, that people have this sense of how to create shelter. And indeed, in an extreme situation, people will know that they need to create shelter, and they'll find a way of doing it. Children do it sort of automatically. They play house, or they get in under the table and say, oh, this is my little house, and so on and so forth. So we sort of know, and that's the basis of that know-it-all condition that really inspired the Be Your Own Architect process. So the work I've been doing from that point basically is teaching people this whole design, how to design a house and really how to build it. But the interesting thing that came out of that process was that as people built these houses, and I, of course, got drawn into that process myself, that as they started living in these buildings, it was like their lives were expanding in all sorts of interesting ways. It was like the house was acting as a nutrient for their own personal development. So in one extreme case, a couple built a reasonable sized house, had a large sitting room in the house that they didn't furnish initially because they didn't have any money for it. There was enough room in the rest of the house. And Mary decided she wanted a career change, started studying to be a teacher. During that process, she thought it might be nice to open a school. Rang me up and said, Peter, we were thinking of opening a school in the sitting room. What do you think? And I think, well, I think you probably lost the plot. Like, open a school in the house. Like, what are you going on about? Oh, yeah, we were looking at the figures and the floor area is good and everything else. Well, okay, I'll pull out the drawings and have a look. So I looked at the drawings, went and had a look at the house, and I thought, you're right. You could probably do it. So we needed to change a window into a door to provide, a second exit out of the room. And there was a small downstairs toilet across the hall that, curiously enough, had enough room in it to put a child-sized toilet and wash and basin in. There was a big hall in the house. It was perfect. I said, this is not coincidence. This is in the design. That aspiration was in that woman as we went through the design process, and it manifested itself in the building despite our unconsciousness in regards to it. So that's what gave rise to this idea of the living architecture, that the building that you live in, that you can have this living relationship with it. So that allowed me to really, I suppose, fine-tune the whole design methodology that I was developing, that the focus of it is in on these living aspects of the building. And because life is largely an invisible, really, experience, the focus of what I want to talk about today and the workshop segment that I'll present afterwards is on these invisible aspects of the architecture and how we can take these invisible aspects into account so that we can create living spaces, that we can create buildings that have a relationship not just to our life but to the wider life, and really also to promote the general debate about architecture, because it's very narrow at the moment, that people whether it's through lack of vocabulary or lack of confidence or lack of interest or whatever. I don't think it's through lack of interest. Most people are interested in the architecture, but say in comparison to painting or something, people can sit down around a dinner table and have a meaningful conversation about painting, but architecture, it seems to be very limited range. So to promote the general discussion about architecture so that people can sort of repossess their, I suppose what I'd call their shelter making rights. Now, in your sort of general handouts, there are some notes that relate to the presentation. So if you wanted to make a note as I go through this in terms of maybe questions you want to ask at the question and answer session, or if you want to go through my workshop segment. Now, all of this is sort of pretty intense stuff, and it tends to open up what some people might think of as the can of worms. That the architecture is interesting as it touches on all these different aspects of life, as we saw with Stuart's presentation. It goes directly into people's really lives, and the reason I'm saying that is that you might feel a bit overwhelmed with some of the things I'm going to say. That it all has a very firm basis, really, and that it has to do with opening up our natural sense of what architecture is and sort of grasping it, because there's a lot of fear around the topic, which is what I encountered as a young man, that if I didn't buy this house and I didn't settle down, all these terrible things would happen to me. But the truth of it is, I'm here today because I made those steps, and when I met Alana, I was still a person without a mortgage, and that I was able to make the choice to come to Australia because I wasn't burdened, by these ties to Ireland. Now, I still maintain my ties to Ireland, and Alana's discovered a lot of her own, what might be called her dreaming in Ireland. But Australia's been wonderful for me in respect of, nurturing these ideas, because Ireland it's an island people, they need to be pushing people like myself offshore. So I'm very delighted to be here. So we'll start with this one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what architecture is, or how I see architecture. Considered to be the mother of the arts. Now that can seem a little surprising that it is up there, but when we think about it, in the animal kingdom, they practice their own architecture, and that it is an expression of the human aliveness, that it's completely connected in with us living our lives, whether it's just a domestic scale building or something more formal. It all has the same root, creating buildings in which we can basically live our lives. So then the vernacular architecture would be the first architecture, and this is where the people building the houses in California, the people building the houses in rural Ireland, asking me for advice. This is really the tradition they're working in, and this is the tradition in which I was not trained. And architects a lot of times refer to that tradition as architecture with a small a. So this is just a couple of examples, and I suppose the main characteristic there is basically working with the earth. And for me, one of the wonderful things about coming to Australia has been beginning to work with the earth. One of my projects was featured in the Owner Builder magazine, and someone who worked with earth saw that and introduced me to the material called clay straw, which I'll talk a little bit more later on. But it was that handling of the earth and touching the earth is where so much inspiration came from. And, you know, that's one of the primary materials that goes back historically in the architecture. You know, the branches and, you know, the clay and the ochres that we can see there. So the first documented shelter making, you know, goes back about 12,000 years in the Fertile Crescent. So it's very much linked in with settled society. The nomadic peoples don't need shelter in the same way as the settled people do, and that's well evidenced here in Australia, where the Aboriginal people haven't developed an architecture similar to the white fellow, and that a lot of it then is about territory, it's about settling, it's about surpluses, it's about property, and ultimately about economy. So the architecture touches all these vital aspects of our lives, and this is one of the reasons it's important that people have a facility to talk about architecture, because it's such a critical thing in terms of their lives. So really the inspiration for the architecture, you know, comes from, you know, nature. Here's the, you know, beautiful little bird's nest that, you know, just came my way, that the natural shelter making then is always connected in with reproduction, with family, with nesting. These are the swallows that occupied, you know, my first little self-built house before I managed to get into it myself. And then at the Laura Dance Festival last summer, they had a very, very simple humpy. And here's somebody's sort of crazy dream nest up in the tree. And then the motivation to create the architecture, it's coming straight out of our survival instinct. It's a direct expression of our desire to, you know, maintain our aliveness, that we need the architecture, or we think we need the architecture. One of the, you know, the worst things that people think that can happen to them in a developed society is that they actually lose their, you know, the place that they would live. And if that unfortunate thing happens to people, yeah, then they're looking at doorways and they're looking at shopping carts and they're looking at bridges and so on. There's always this desire and this need to express your architecture. In other words, to declare your space, to maintain your uniqueness. And it's this growing out of our instinctual desire for life is what energizes us and, you know, inspires the creation of the architecture. And of course the other side of that then is the food aspect of it. The food and the shelter is what Stuart was talking about. Really, that's what keeps us going. The fresh air and the water. They're the basic things that we really need. So maintaining the aliveness. We need the air, the water, the food, the sociability. We're social animals. That's part of our survival strategy. So that's then the basis of the family, it's the basis of tribes, it's the basis of nations, and it's really the basis of what I call the shelter making. It's very, very difficult to build a house on your own. You have to involve other people in the process, and traditionally that was done, you know, by the barn raising or by tribal, you know, people getting together. Here's some people at one of my workshops. The women love what I do. Yeah, the guys like what I do, and the women love what I do. And here's some guys, you know, having a manly conversation about, you know, they're yeah, how are we going to figure this one out? And here's the food. And here's, you know, you can't have something exciting like architecture without a bit of sex. And, you know, that is what the nesting really is all about. The anthropologists call them the breeding sites, is how they describe it. That's one of the main driving forces in terms of having a little bit of territory, is that, you know, we can reproduce. So the knowledge then to create the architecture, because when we look at the vernacular architecture, we're not looking at a bunch of people that have been to architecture school. They've been to the school, really, of life. And that knowledge then is in our genes, what I call the shelter maker gene, that we know instinctively how to create the architecture. Yeah, if we just go at it, we're probably not going to create a piece of fabulous architecture, but we have the basic instincts, and that if we refine that, like anything we approach and anything we do, the more we do it, the better we get at doing it. And, you know, here's a student of mine building his house, you know, with his friends, and here's a volunteer who was working with me for a bit, dancing in the clay straw, and I suppose his face tells it all. He's having a great time. So then the actual creation of the architecture, what happens when we create the architecture? It creates self-awareness. Now that's an interesting one I'll talk about a little bit more. The basis of cultural and artistic expression. So, you know, if you're traveling in Europe or traveling in South America or whatever, and you want to send a postcard home to illustrate to people like where you are and stuff, you probably send a photograph of a traditional building, maybe with a person in traditional costume outside it. All of these things arise from the creation of the architecture. The original art really was the decorative aspects of the architecture, like the building was actually an artwork in itself. And it's only in more recent times then that the artistic aspects of the shelter making have been detached from the wall so that it can go into an art gallery and basically can be sold. It's the basis of mythological, you know, religious inquiry, because it promotes this level of self-awareness. And I'll talk a little bit about, explain a little bit about that now in a moment. Then it leads to the development of the ethics and the morals, which of course is reflected in the permaculture and the permaculture that Stuart was talking about. Very, very much linked in then with the economics, that's what an economy is. It's providing people with air, food, water, and shelter. And of course then it's tied in with agriculture and the growth of civilization. So it's very, the architecture touches all these different aspects of life, is what it basically amounts to. So here we can see just a selection of images that I suppose reflect that. That's Alana, my beautiful wife, in the garden in our place in Ireland where she grew this giant cabbage called Big Macs. Some people have said, yeah, the cabbage is just normal size, and that's actually a fairy, but... so the formal architecture then, we've looked at the vernacular tradition. The formal architectural tradition grew out of the vernacular tradition. So the formal architects will think of this, even though they mightn't say it, of architecture with a big A. And what we see there are some fairly typical examples of formal architecture buildings. The pyramids, the Parthenon, Chartres Cathedral, and then that's a plan of the Parthenon, and then that's Le Corbusier's modular man. All of this is reflecting, I suppose, a rational approach to the architecture, and that we can see evidence of the sacred geometry here in that image of the plan, where the formal architecture took buildings and sort of analyzed them, rationalized it, isolated, the perfect proportions, and that then gets applied to the physical buildings as a reflection of really what happens in nature, and that therefore these formal architectural buildings are natural in themselves. But it's a more contrived approach than people just building instinctively and naturally out of their own instinctiveness. But what it does illustrate is that we're all connected into these natural principles. The other interesting thing about these ancient structures is they have this mysterious quality about them. Orientation and how light penetrates them are very important. I had an interesting experience myself in Chartres Cathedral. I literally saw this energetic fountain, I suppose you could call it, coming up out of the altar in Chartres Cathedral. And I had an interesting experience in Newgrange, which is in Ireland, and it predates the pyramids, where on the winter solstice, a light beam, sort of like that projector, shines down this long passage and illuminates the central chamber in Newgrange. I was fortunate to be in that back in the late 60s. So what you find in a lot of these ancient structures, that orientation is important, proportion is important, position on the earth is important, and there's a lot of invisible forces acting on the building to create particular feelings. But one of the things about the formal architecture is the knowledge on how to create the architecture was kept secret. It was kept within what might be called a priesthood, and that tradition largely, continues to the sort of present day. So this notion then that there's some secrets within the architectural professions, and you find traces of that when you look, say, at the Masonic movement, that the symbols maintain. The pendulum would be an interesting one, that the pendulum, I suppose, spans the divide in many ways, that the builders use the pendulum to ensure the walls are standing up straight, but the diviner will be using the pendulum to find out if this is a good place to build the building, or to detect particular sorts of energies. So you see these representations of these tools, I suppose, particularly in things like the Masonic imagery. In comparison then, the vernacular is basically an oral tradition, and it's handed down then by literally teaching and literally doing. So this is what I fell into when I started my Be Your Own Architect, Living Architecture Centre. And the interesting thing was, as part of that process, there was no book on house design. This is a surprising one. If you go to look for a book that would teach you how to design a house, you'll find it very, very difficult. Yeah, I myself have written a book in 2 volumes called Be Your Own Architect, where I articulate the process that I have developed. So any of the sort of secrets I revealed today, they're secrets that I myself have uncovered. And I suppose the big secret about the architectural profession is there isn't a secret anymore. At one point there were secrets in respect of, the proportioning and the divination and so on and so forth. That seems to have died out around the time of the French Revolution, where the prevalence of, scientific rationalism and so on, it took over, and that the French school of architecture influenced then sort of Europe and the rest of the world. So, as I say, the big secret is there are no secrets. So here we have some images of, teaching people about the shelter making. That's all happening in Ireland. So then the realization of the architecture, whether it's formal architecture or it's vernacular architecture, it's very much a hands-on process. That the creation of the architecture is like the preparation of the food. So it's good to look at the food and the shelter as comparative things that, people have never given up growing their own food. They've slackened off in terms of creating their own architecture, but their sensitivity to the food can be applied to the architecture. In other words, in terms of the building of the buildings, we have to create the buildings sensitively, just like we have to prepare the food sensitively if we want to have a really, really nice meal and a really nice experience. And I suppose for me, architecture is an experience more than anything else. That architecture is not actually a thing. We tend to think of architecture as being a thing, but it's actually an experience, just like, food, we could think of it as a thing, but the real experience of food is in eating it. And the pleasure then in the eating is based on how well was the food prepared. So everybody mucks in, local materials, local natural materials, low cost, and as a consequence, pretty low embodied energy. And all of the building materials, of course, come out of Mother Earth. That's where they all emerge from. And here we can see some of the clay play going on. So when we create the architecture, it's this expression of this aliveness, it's this outpicturing of our instinctive desire to remain alive. So it's connected then to the air, to the water, particularly to the sun, because the bulk of life forms, that's where they get their energy from. They get it from the solar energy. The wind, the food, the territory. This is very, very important. The territory is our sense of our own self, our piece of personal territory. You might be wondering why the hat is on the table. It's because Rob asked me a question when I arrived. He says, "What's the ultimate piece of architecture?" And I'm thinking, God, what's the answer to that? I said, "Is there an answer to that?" He said, "Yes, it's the hat is the ultimate piece of architecture." And that was from a book called Architecture Without Architects. So my mind was going like, how do I work this one out? Yes, it is me making my piece of territory around myself, just like when I was coming up on the tram or up on the bus, I was a bit conscious I was carrying all this stuff. Oh, maybe I'm taking up a little bit too much territory. That's what we do. That's an aspect of our aliveness. We mark out our territory, and that's what we're doing when we occupy the architecture. We're marking out our territory, and the territorial stuff will bring up all sorts of issues, particularly gender issues, issues between men particularly, because that's the natural instinctive protection of the territory. I'm going to get the food, I'm going to get the pretty girl stuff. That if we don't make this stuff conscious, it gets mixed up into the architecture and everybody gets sort of confused about what's going on. So there's where the connection into the reproduction arises. The architecture then will confer the identity. People will have their photograph taken outside their house or whatnot, that it's where they get their sense of self from. And that's an interesting one because it gives this power to what the architecture looks like on the outside, when in fact the most important aspect of the architecture in terms of living in it is what happens on the inside. So it really doesn't matter too much what it looks like on the outside, except, if you're concerned what it looks like to other people. And the creativity, it's where we're stimulating our own sense of aliveness, and that we can't go wrong with that. If we trust in our own creativity, if we trust in our instinctive ability to create shelter, it will not bring us wrong. And also in the ritual that the architecture and the making of the architecture will inevitably involve some sort of ritualistic behavior. And you can sort of see that in the photograph here, where, you know, the frame is being made, and then, you know, people start talking to each other. And this is what I find with the teaching. It gives people a context where, you know, they start talking about all sorts of stuff to do with their lives, because they're realizing that it's all connected in with the architecture. So this stimulation of the self-awareness, it arises through the creation of boundaries, and really that's what we're doing when we create the architecture. You can see there in the top illustration the plan and the cross-section of the igloo, but what it does is it gives us a sense of the territory we're marking out around ourselves. So on one level, it's like drawing your line in the sand, or wearing the hat, or wearing the flamboyant clothes, or having a loud voice, or whatever. You're marking out your piece of territory. You're saying, yes, I am different. I am an individual. And that when we do that and we bring it up into our consciousness, and I suppose that's really what I'm talking about, that we know a lot of this stuff instinctively, but we need to bring it up into our consciousness, where we know what we're doing when we create the architecture, and we know what we're doing when we're using the architecture, that we can use it as a nutrient for our own self-development, but we need to have an awareness of who we are and what our lives are all about in order to benefit from the fullness of this. So these sort of photographs illustrate how people a lot of times see architecture, that it's presenting the pretty streetscape. It's saying, yes, we're doing okay. Got our territory sorted, say, in comparison to some of the favela photographs that we saw from South America. It's more chaotic, it's more colorful, it's more exciting in many ways. So the boundaries create separation. That's what the creation of the plan. This is why, architecture has been designed a lot of times. It's got to get a plan. We got to get a plan. We got to make those boundaries so that we can start seeing something. So here's a project that I call the Headspace, and it came out of some of my work with the models, because I do a lot of work with the models as a way of keying into some of these instinctive aspects of the architecture. So I'd build models, and you could cut out windows in the models and so on. You could sort of look inside, but you could never quite get a sense of the space. So then I made a little periscope, and I cut a hole in the bottom of the model and put the periscope up in it. But that was totally confusing. It was like the image was upside down, and it was all weird. And then I thought, if I made a model big enough that I could put my head in it, I could see inside the model. And it just remained as an idea until there was a TV documentary being made, and I said to the director guy, oh yeah, the Headspace. And he says, what's that? And I said, oh, that's the model you can put. He said, we got to build one of those. So they got somebody to build a model, and you can see me here standing underneath the model, and here I'm standing up in the model. The interesting thing about that was you were in that space when your head was in that space. You were literally in that space, and yet it was only your head that was in the space. It was this interesting experience of the separation that the architecture facilitates, and that it's all to do with this creation of boundaries and creating then this scale. You've got this small enclosed space, and then you've got this bigger, wider world outside. So then that type of separation that the architecture generates, so, we have it here today. If that wall wasn't there, yeah, we wouldn't feel enclosed in this space. We'd be part of that outside world. So the separation allows for things to be compared. We compare what it's like to be in here as opposed to being outside. So we can see things then relative really to each other. And then in the case of how people see themselves relative to buildings, that's where their sense of identity comes from. And it stimulates this inquiry into the nature of that world that's outside. So the architecture then creates this, or promotes this sense of our own individuality, and then you have the outside world out there and you can begin to see yourself in relationship to it. So then that's really the basis of the inquiry into, like, what is that big world out there? So here we have the image of the yurt wheel. So that would be considered in the Mongolian cultures that build yurts, that's the axis of the earth, and that they're seeing that outside world. And I had a book of yurts, and I'd looked through it a lot of times, a lot of pictures in it, and I wondered for a long time, why did they have a picture of planet Earth in the yurt book? And it was only on a detailed examination of that book one day I realized that what I was looking at in the yurt book was a photograph of the sky with some clouds in it that just happened to look like that iconic image that they took coming back from the moon of the Earth. So I could see literally how people could begin to see the house as this world really in microcosm. And it's all a reflection of what we have inside us. So the formal architecture rose from the vernacular traditions with an emphasis on keeping that knowledge secret. And that knowledge is where the basis of the power and the status, and that's something that's very prevalent today in terms particularly of housing and economics, and I'll sort of delve into that a little bit. But it's also a reflection of how the architecture really is connected in with our lives. So some of this imagery then is derived from the feng shui and from the Vastu Shastra traditions. And here we see the application of the sacred geometry on the buildings. But, traditionally, those Eastern traditions key far more into this living aspect of the architecture than does the Western tradition. So what is the architecture made from? It's literally made from boundaries that we call the building fabric. So here we have in miniature, the boundaries. And of course, that's all that you can see of the architecture. So when architecture is being developed, there's always a mad rush to create something that can be seen very, very quickly. But if that shape that's created does not work in terms of what's going to happen inside it, it can be very, very difficult to change it. So the building fabric is basically the walls, the floors, and the roof. And then there's openings made in those walls, floors, and roofs to allow people, animals, and things to go in and out, for air and light to penetrate, and for smoke, stale air, and waste to exit. That literally is how simple architecture is. It's literally a box with a lid on it, and it has holes in it that we call doors and windows and chimneys and so on and so forth. That there's no mystique there at all. That the living part of the architecture, we really can't see it. It remains invisible to us. And in many ways, this is why there's an odd perception of what architecture is. We think of architecture as a thing, because we think buildings are things, but they're actually experiences, they're boxes. And the box is a very, very simple thing. In terms of creating architecture, we can craft a really fine box. It's the shape of the box that's the critical thing. And the shape of the box has to follow what we want to happen inside in the box. And that's where the interesting linkage into the permaculture comes from. The house really is a box in which you plant yourself. And just like if you're going to plant a citrus tree or you're going to plant a fruit tree or something, you make sure that the box you planted in is suitable. You make sure that soil is suitable. You make sure it's been put in the right place so that it'll bear fruit. The house is the same. In order to create that building fabric that will nurture that life, we have to inquire into the nature of that life. And of course, that's invisible and something that's hard to get in touch with. So the boundaries formed by the building fabric, they enclose the interior space of the building and they separate it from the outside world so that you get an outside and an inside. So here's the inside of the building and everything then that surrounds it, or in the case of this room, we're on the inside of the building, and that's really the outside world. That the architecture, the function of it, or one of the functions of it, is to separate off space so that we can do things like this, or you can live your life, or whatever it is you want to do. But interestingly enough, the inside and the outside of the buildings consists of the same thing. So here you have the frame of the building so that you can see that what is outside flows into what is inside, and that if we clad that structure with the building fabric, we will create this separation. And that allows us then to get in touch with space. And space has these three dimensions. It has length, breadth, height, and that's what allows us to orient ourselves in the world. So we're here on North Terrace, north, south, east, west, up, down, back, front. That's how we orient ourselves in this vastness of space, and that's one of the functions of the architecture. When we get inside it, it allows us to orient ourselves because we're in this vast space that pretty much goes on forever. So normally we orient ourselves on the sun, and this orientation to the sun, which of course in formal architecture is passive solar design and so on, so it's a rational explanation, but on a humanitarian level, what we're doing is, we're seeing which direction is up, and of course I still have a problem with that because I'm used to the sun rising in the east and going to the south and setting in the west. So here in Australia I'm going like, oh, it's rising there and it's going that way. It's completely different because I'm literally turned on my head because my orientation to the sun is completely different. But this orientation to the sun introduces this dimension, the fourth dimension of architecture, which is time. And this is the great big ignored dimension of architecture that affects each and every one of us in profound ways. We become aware of that dimension of time by virtue of the fact that we have night and day. So we have change. So this dimension of time, which is as infinite as space is, we perceive that dimension by virtue of the fact that things are constantly changing. So that daily rhythm allows us to perceive these cycles of change, which is basically how life operates. It's constantly changing, constantly changing, constantly changing. And that's what we need to do in our own selves. We need to allow ourselves to change, and the architecture can facilitate that. Why that doesn't happen, I'll explain shortly. So we can calibrate then that rhythm of those changes by the daily rhythm, the lunar cycle, the years, and so on and so forth, is how we can grasp that we live in this world that's changing. When we incorporate that then into the architecture, we can see that the architecture is made up of this combination of 4 dimensions called space, time, and that when we apply that to the plan, that we can see the house acts as a sort of a clock, that we can be inside that. We don't need physical clocks. We can be aware of the way things are changing on a daily basis. But the interesting thing is that the architecture encompasses these 4 dimensions. Can you think of anything else in life that combines those 4 dimensions, which are all the dimensions of the world as we know it? So when we're creating architecture and we're experiencing architecture, we're dealing with all of the dimensions of the world as we know it, which is quite a remarkable thing. So life itself, like, what is it? It's distinguished by a capacity for growth, reproduction. So here we have the reproduction coming up again. Functional activity, we can do stuff. Continual change. This is a dictionary definition. Continual change preceding death. And of course, this is the big elephant in the room, where our survival instincts are driving us to remain alive. We are constantly facing this fear that at some point we are going to die. So our lives are actually, these are the bookends between our birth and our death, and that is characterized by this time dimension. So when we bring the time dimension into the architecture consciously, it's very much to do with being able to live our lives between these 2 bookends. So then life, matter and energy, that's what it is, but they're actually one and the same thing. So the recycling symbol just characterizes this constant rhythmic quality that life has, that the yin-yang symbol will symbolize as well. And this matter and energy, it's constantly in this, what's called the dynamic equilibrium. It's constantly, the balance is constantly changing. It's not a static balance, it's a dynamic balance. And as has been discovered in the quantum physics, when we look deeply at the matter, it appears to be energetic, and when we look at the energy, it appears to be matter, that it's all one of the same things, just like our own bodies are, that we're in this constant rhythmic change, and unless the architecture can support that change, we become calcified, we become deadened. And because of what's happened to the architecture on a commercial level, it's had this deadening effect on people and on the world, and a lot of the struggles that are going on right now are sort of focused on that. So then the energy which animates the matter, creating aliveness, it's called really the life energy. So in Eastern cultures then that's called the chi or the prana. So in the feng shui, it's the gathering in of the positive life energy. In the Vastu Shastra, it's the prana. And that life force is coming out of the space and the time. So when we enclose the space in the building, what we're doing is we're putting boundaries on a small amount of space-time, and then the energy that's going to energize our lives can be focused in a particular way. And that is the function in the feng shui and the Vastu, is to ensure that the quality of that life energy is beneficent to the people who are living in the people who are living in the building. And that life energy then flows through our bodies and in particular ways. So then the people, they're made up of the same stuff, the matter and the energy, exactly the same as the architecture, and we ourselves then exist in these 4 dimensions. Physical exterior, just like the building does. Then we have this invisible interior, just like the architecture does. You cannot see anything in there. It's invisible, just like our own psyche is. So that's where the shelter-making instinct resides. It's in our psyche, it's in our instincts, and then some of the other invisible aspects of ourselves, the mind, our consciousness, our personalities, our self, and interestingly enough, the collective unconscious, all reside within this invisible interior which is inside ourselves. So Carl Jung founded the analytical psychology. He, interestingly enough, used the architecture as a means of assessing the psyche by playing house. So he'd go out in his garden and he'd play with the mud, and he used that as a way then of assessing his own psyche and putting these theories together. He also designed and constructed his own home as a way of accessing his own dreaming. So the nature of our own selves and the world as we want to live it is inside it, and how we access that is through our own dreaming, either in sleep or in consciously accessing what it is we have to do in our lives. So that collective unconscious is made up of these archetypes, so those recurring patterns of thinking that represent typical human experience. So this is in our genes, the complete history of humanity as it has evolved over millions of years. And that's then the strength of the mythology and the symbolism and the story all emerges out of the collective unconscious, and we can tap into that either consciously or in our dreams. So when we go to create our architecture, this is where the know-it-all knowledge comes from. It comes out of the collective unconscious. And the dreaming, what does it do to us? It impels us to pursue our own distinctiveness, which is actually a process. It's this discovery of our unique selves, what Carl Jung called the process of individuation. So here's me in my little econospace, which I've built over in Castlemaine, giving myself a reminder of what way is up, because I get so confused because I'm in the southern hemisphere. So this is an interesting one. Jung believed that our lives can be understood as a process of becoming what was intended from the beginning. So this notion of our individuality, our personal selves, that we're born with this potentiality. And he said that individual process was likened to the discovery of the maternal womb. So if we look at then that maternal womb, it's temperature controlled, it's fully serviced, your food and water on demand, and you've got integrated waste disposal. It's like the perfect condominium. And that, we're basically flushed out of that perfect place, and that a lot of times we spend a lot of time and energy and money trying to recreate it by creating the perfect place. As long as we do it unconsciously, we live unconscious lives. So if you look at the world and a lot of the problems in the world, it's because people haven't realized that they've actually been flushed out of that womb, that they need to provide their own food and water, and they very much need to take responsibility for their own waste, that people are living like, they don't realize they've been born, and they have to take those things, responsibility for those things themselves. So then this notion of individuation, it's really quite a modern trend. It's, you know, in an evolutionary sense, it's something completely new, and it's arisen out of the industrialization process, where we don't have to spend as much time providing our food, water, and our shelter. We can just get that on the open market. It's readily available, because basically we've used machines to exploit the earth and create loads and loads of stuff, which has freed up our time to be ourselves. So this is a picture of me in my mortgage-free cabin in Ireland. So this individuation process that was happening in Carl Jung's work was reflected in the wider society in respect of the Beats in the 50s in America and the hippies in the 60s. And of course the hippies have had a bad press, and you know, very much written off, and people saying, oh, it's just an old hippie. But their philosophy, of course, is based on love and sharing, the idea of being yourself and doing your own thing. Now that isn't the basis of a good economy from economics point of view. So the market basically took that evolutionary twist that was happening and created essentially the me generation, where, yeah, you're the most important thing, and satisfying you is the most important thing. And it had this huge emphasis on materialism. So in the 70s, we saw a lot of change. We saw the Reaganomics. We saw a break with the gold standard. So economics changed completely. And, you know, people became obsessed with their own selves. The process of individuation is not an obsession with yourself. It's all about trying to live your life. And of course, this is very much connected with architecture, which is there really to support life. So the function of the architecture is maintaining the aliveness through conscious shelter making. We have to approach it very, very consciously by looking at what's inside ourselves, by introducing ritual into the process, by expressing ourselves clearly. And then the art, the music, the poetry, the dance, these are all connected to the shelter making. Yes, they become separated out over time, but in their origins, they are all part of the process of people creating their own places in which to live. And all of that parallels our discovery of who we are in our own psyche and in our own selves. So what's happened if architecture had all this potentiality and continues to have all this potentiality? How come things are in such a mess? People gave up the shelter making. So why did people give up the shelter making? They gave up the shelter making for the promise of a better life. They gave up the shelter making in favor of a job. So it's very much linked in with the industrialization processes, because building your own house, growing your own food, none of it is easy. The market has taken up the shelter making process, but not bringing to that process any of the richness of the developmental line from which it originates. So the global economics now dictates how we obtain our fresh air, our water, our food, and our shelter, and basically how much we pay for them, because that is the basis of economics, is how people are getting their essentials they need to maintain their aliveness. So that's the basis of the economics. Yeah, they haven't quite managed to capture this one, but you know, they're making it pretty dirty. The water companies, water rights being brought up all over the place. People have never quite given up on this one, so that's having a real revival. But this one has been ring-fenced by legislation and so on, because it's so deeply connected in with the economics. So economics relies on money as a means of exchange. So that facilitates trade. So money is basically a good thing. But money is just a token. It's like a piece of paper, a fancy piece of paper. It has to be secured against something. So traditionally that would be the precious metals, the gold and so on. In more recent times, the art would be considered to have intrinsic value, or property. So the money in the economy then is secured against something that's considered to have real worth. So the precious metals, the art, and particularly the property. So the banks issue more money than they're actually holding valuables. You know, the fractional reserve banking. Money is considered to grow due to the interest. So that requires that the assets the loan are secured against continuously grow. So this is basically the property market. Anything else you buy, a fridge, a car, whatever, drops in value. Buy a piece of property, it rises in value. Completely anomalous situation. Completely notional, that value in property. Because all the other things you buy, so this is what we're seeing in the global financial meltdown. The property values can't be realized, so the loans are, people are defaulting on their loans. So the true value of property lies in the fact that it allows people to maintain their livelihoods. This is the real value of the house, that it's an asset, an economic asset that you can actually get inside and sleep and reproduce and so on and so forth. And that is how the market and the economy sucks people in and holds them tight into this economy that everybody knows is basically destroying the world. It's because the value of money has been attached and secured to physical buildings. And then that economic system has its own agenda, which is, you know, a lot of people getting very, very wealthy from the fact that people can only get houses in one way, by buying them through the debt system. That's basically what's happened. People gave up making their own houses. Economy took over. The market took over and said, okay, you can only get houses in one particular way if you borrow all this money, and you're basically pledging your time for 20 or 30 years into the future, and that restricts your ability to change. And this is what's happening in the world. People feel stuck because they've pledged their time, is basically what they're doing. People have sold their time. So you sell your time when you get a mortgage, and you pledge that for 30 years you're going to make these repayments every month. That restricts your ability to make choices and to make changes. So this is where people are locked into the economy that they're desperately trying to get away from. So just to summarize, the creation of architecture is instinctive, very much connected with our aliveness, involves issues of territory, status, reproduction and sociability. If we can't look at those things consciously when we're doing the street we want to live in or what we feel entitled to, we have to examine all those things. The self-awareness will arise through direct engagement with the shelter-making process. Now, you don't have to go out and build. You can go through this process on the kitchen table, and that's what we'll be looking at in the workshop segment, how to stimulate our internal architect. When the house design is carried out by professionals, and interesting enough, there are no dedicated schools of house design in the world. Well, the Living Architecture Centre sort of does that. But that's the only one I'm aware of. The emphasis is on the material aspects of the architecture and of the building. There's no attention paid to what I call the invisible architecture. It's just purely a physical thing. So that results then in buildings that have this very dead feeling. So what do we need to do? we need to basically capture our shelter making. So here's me teaching some people. We'll be doing that in the workshop session. So just a little, I suppose, commercial look at what's available here. Yeah, there are some Living Architecture DVDs that visit houses that people had created themselves and basically talks to them and lays down then some of the philosophy of the Living Architecture. There's the Living Architecture course, which emerged from the original Be Your Own Architect courses that I started 20 years ago. So that encompasses the Living Architecture, the Handbook of House Design and Construction, a design program, and various worksheets. And interesting enough, that transfers very well to the Australian context. The econospace making is something I've been working on the last few years as a way of allowing people to create physical buildings as opposed to just models. These are buildings that you can build in your garden without a permit. You're not supposed to live in them and so on, but there's pointers as how to avoid getting caught in that material. Yeah, you have to be nimble on your feet. So that's the little 10 square metre version over here that I've built, because this is your 10 square metre Victorian garden shed. In Ireland, you can build a garden shed of 25 square metres. So that was the first building I made on the little block of land I got. And then I've produced this, what I call Living Architecture Primer. It's a little handmade booklet with a DVD, a data-based DVD. And what's on that then is there are a lot of published articles from magazines. You can start working on the Living Architecture course and on the econospace making. And it has this half-hour documentary that was made by Irish TV a couple of years ago. So if you wanted to continue following the course, there's a $15 voucher in the booklet, so you can put that $15 to the if you want to follow one of those upgrade, I think is what it's called. So that's basically it, folks. Thank you very much.